Okay, welcome everyone to this conversation between Margaret Busby and Susheila Nasta on publishing Black women's writing in Britain. It's part of the module in post-colonial global literature here at Queen Mary. I'm really delighted to be hosting both of them for this conversation. So I'm going to start by introducing our speakers this evening, and then I'm going to hand over to Susheila, who'll be leading the discussion between the two of them, but there will be time for some questions at the end, which I'll be moderating. At the time when we get to the questions, please either raise your hands or put something in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on both of those. So today with us, of course, is Susheila Nasta, who's here with us at Queen Mary. She's a founder of Wasafiri, the magazine of international contemporary writing that she launched in 1984 and directed as editor-in-chief till 2019. She's a literary activist, writer, and presenter, and professor of contemporary and modern literatures here at Queen Mary, and Professor Emerita at the Open University. She has judged a number of national and international prizes. She was recently chair of the SI Leeds Prize for a first novel by an Asian woman writer, and is currently on the judging panel for the David Cohen Prize, which rewards a lifetime's work in any genre. She has published widely, especially in the field of Caribbean, South Asian, and Black British writing, and is committed to diversity and public engagement. Editor of one of the first critical anthologies of Black women's writing, Motherlands, in 1991. She's also known for her work as critic and literary executor of Sam Salwan, who's now very familiar to the students on the module, and she has a number of prominent publications as well. She's currently writing a personal memoir interspersed with time completing a biography of the Bloomsbury Indians. I hope that Susheila will say a little bit more about her memoir this evening. In 2019, she received the Benson Medal from the Royal Society of Literature for a lifetime's achievement. And a year later, she was awarded an honorary fellowship from the English Association, recognizing her contribution to English studies. With Susheila this evening is Margaret Busby, who's a major cultural figure in Britain and around the world. We're really excited to have her and to be welcoming her sort of virtually to Queen Mary tonight. She was born in Ghana and educated in the UK, graduating from London University. She became Britain's youngest and first Black woman publisher when she co-founded Allison and Busby in the late 1960s and published notable authors, including Buchi Mcheta, Nuruddin Farah, Rosa Guy, C.L.R. James, Michael Moorcock, and Jill Murphy. She's a writer, editor, broadcaster, and literary critic. She has also written drama for BBC Radio and the stage. Her radio abridgments and dramatizations encompass work by Henry Louis Gates, Timothy Moe, Walter Mosley, Jean Rhys, Sam Salwan, and Raoul Shayinka. She has interviewed high-profile writers, among them Toni Morrison and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. She's judged prestigious literary prizes, including the Booker Prize, and served on the boards of such organizations as the Royal Literary Fund, Wasafiri Magazine, Tomorrow's Warriors, and the Africa Centre in London. She's a longtime campaigner for diversity in publishing and a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and recipient of several honorary doctorates and awards, including the Bocca's Henry Swansea Award, the Royal Society of Literature's Benson Medal, and the Royal African Society's inaugural Africa Rights Lifetime Achievement Award. So we really warmly welcome you both here this evening, and I look forward to hearing your conversation.
Thanks, Charlotta. I don't know how I can follow that. I mean, Margaret and I have been friends for a very, very long time, since the early 80s, and I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to have this conversation. I mean, Margaret's been an inspiration, not only to me, but to writers, to publishers worldwide, and young editors for many, many years, and the literary world of letters would be hugely deprived without her presence. It's over 50 years that she's been doing this, and she is unbelievably humble about what she's done, and we'll never really talk about it, but so I'm very pleased you've done that introduction. I could say much, much more, but I don't want to embarrass her. I've known Margaret, as I said, a long time, going back to the early 80s, the days of Wasafiri, when I started that in 84, and also to the period of the International Book Fair, Black and Third World Books. And Margaret was, of course, chair of Wasafiri for many years. We've shared many festival stages and panels I think we were together in the early 90s. I've just found an old leaflet called From Out of the Margins with John LaRose of the pioneering publishing house New Beacon Books, as well as many others. And we were strangely talking about this very same topic in the 1990s. That panel was called Publishing Today, What Can We Do? What Can We Change? And so on, which is actually quite interesting in the context of what we're going to be talking about today in terms of the past, the present, and the future. I guess the other thing I should say is the last time Margaret and I had a conversation like this, we were sitting in a very, very nice place in Kerala at a very warm on a warm outdoor stage at a literary festival, which was the last time I think I attended a literary festival. And neither of us knew we were going to be locked up for this period. So this is really the first time since then that we are having this conversation. I want to start really with an essay which I know some of you, the students on the course, will have read by Bernardine Evaristo in a book called Brave New Words, which was the 35th Wasa Theory anthology, in which she said, these are unprecedented times for the Black woman writer. The essay was called What a Time to be a Black, in parentheses, woman, with an X, in parentheses, writer, in parentheses. Unprecedented hadn't become such a buzzword at that point, and Bernardine, at the point she wrote the essay, hadn't won the Booker Prize, which she did with Margaret Atwood for Girl, Woman, Other. And I think she wasn't really thinking about unprecedented in those terms. But I just wanted to begin this conversation, Margaret, by asking you a little bit about your early career, about Alison and Busby, and about promoting writers from all backgrounds in the sort of 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I suppose what I'm going to kick off with is, but we don't have to answer this now, is, are we living through unprecedented times?
Well, thanks, Susheila, and great to see you. I guess we are living in unprecedented times, and we don't know what's going to come next, and we haven't been here before. But there are all sorts of things that we can sort of reflect on, which may not be totally new. Okay, where did I start? Well, I have to go back actually to my being educated in Britain. So I had all my schooling here. I went to university here. And yet, in all my formal curriculum, I didn't read a single book by a Black writer, let alone a Black woman writer. So that was the background to my really seeking literature that I could connect with. And in the early 60s, in fact, when I was at university, I did a course in American literature, which was run for the whole university. So it was run out of King's College, and Eric Mottram was the supervisor. And that was the only bit of my university course that actually came into the 20th century, and in which there was a glimpse of any Black character. That was when we read Faulkner. So that is how undiverse my education was. So I sought out books quite often from secondhand bookshops in Charing Cross Road, and there were quite a lot of anthologies coming out of America. And their anthologies are, Poetry of the Negro. There were one or two anthologies coming out in Britain. And there was a wonderful anthology by a Dutch woman, I think, called Rosie Poole, called Beyond the Blues. Mm-hmm. So it was in all these sort of overseas publications that I came across Black women writers for the first time. And as you said, when I began publishing, I wasn't focusing only on Black writers or only on women writers, but I was just publishing good writers. So they for me, were part of the richness of literature. And I wanted to make sure that kind of was reflected, that there were those possibilities. So, but then there were writers, as you mentioned, Buchi Machetu, who I wanted to publish because I wanted to see what she had to say being made more widely available. She was a Nigerian-born woman living in Britain, bringing up 5 children on her own, as well as educating herself and trying to write. And she was writing about all the challenges she faced in that situation. I wanted to sort of amplify what she was saying. So I think that's the background of what I've been trying to do all along. And it came out in my publishing, it came out in the anthology. The first one was in 1992, and the most recent one was in 1919. I mean, not 1990, what am I talking about? 2019. Whenever it was, sometime in some unprecedented time.
Well, actually, yesterday I got told by some bank that who'd got my birth date wrong, that my birth date was the 1st of January 1901. So that made me feel a bit funny.
I know that feeling.
Yes, I think you've said, haven't you, on various occasions, I think I've heard you say that you kind of wanted to publish the books you were never able to read. And I think it's also something that Carol Phillips talks about quite a lot in one of his books. I can't remember which one it is now. I think it's probably The European Tribe. But anyway, he talks about this idea of being, as a kid growing up, actually feeling that he was starving of the literature that actually would describe the world that he lived in. And I just,
he mentioned that in the preface to Brave New Words. I think
I do, because
I think Kat as well says something. So
yeah,
it's a continuing thing, isn't it?
And I should say, and before we move on to Daughters of Africa, we should mention Myriad Editions, who actually published both Brave New Words and Margaret's New Daughters of Africa. And Candida Lacey was a formative force in the first edition, also of Daughters of Africa.
Exactly.
So I just want to pay tribute to her, because she's done a huge amount as we're going to be talking about editors and publishers, in promoting this writing. So I want to look into sort of history, past and present. So I want to talk about your two amazing publications. Your first, Daughters of Africa, which came out in 1992, which is an anthology of Black women's writing. And it stretches from the period of the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, to the present. And your more recently compiled anthology, New Daughters of Africa. And I can't even begin to add up the numbers of writers that you've covered in these two books and the names you have in them. It's just huge, and I would encourage everybody who's listening to go and read them. But the time gap is really interesting. You know, lots happened in the 90s. It was a period when, actually, rather like now in some ways, lots of Black writers were getting noticed. We did a special issue, I think, of What's the Theory, called Taking the Cake in the 90s, which was all Black writing. And then there was a sort of silence. And then again, it's sort of come up again, and issues around Black publishing of women have come up again. I mean, would you like to comment on that gap between, before we talk about the books, between the 90s and now? I mean, there's been it's a huge stretch of time, obviously, but maybe it motivated you in some way.
It wasn't specifically that. I think there are always writers who could be published, who are published and don't get noticed. So I wouldn't necessarily see it as such a huge gap, but I would see that they were not given the attention. And I think one of the problems with writers of color, women writers of African descent, is that feeling that one writer has to represent them all. And that was one of the feelings I had when I compiled the original Daughters of Africa with Candida's help. I mean, Candida's, commissioning me to do it, because at that time, you'd have thought there were just 3 or 4 women of African descent writing, and they were all African American. And anytime any new Black woman writer published a book, she'd get compared to Maya Angelou or Alice Walker or Toni Morrison, however different she was. And I think that has happened, and that continues to happen. And even when New Daughters of Africa came out in, not 1919, 2019, I did a panel with one of the contributors who had told me about a feature that was going to feature her in a national newspaper, and then they postponed it because they said that it already had a Black woman the week before or something. So there's that continuing thing that one person kind of has to stand in for everybody. And I think that's why there seems to be a gap always, because you have a handful who are meant to represent them all. And so that's why in the first volume there were over 200 writers. In the second volume there are over 200, another completely different 200 writers. And each of those volumes could have been twice the length or 3 times the length. I could do another one tomorrow and not repeat myself. So it's just to show you that there are so many writers who are doing things that are worthy of being read, but we just don't give them the attention they deserve. Or it's not just we do. I mean, you do through Wasafiri, you've done that for 34 years, but it's just that they haven't traditionally been given that airspace, that spotlight, that attention that they deserve, because they're kind of lumped together, just in the same way as now you're hearing that people don't want to use the term BAME. I've never liked the term BAME, but it's that feeling of lumping us all together and thinking that we're all the same, whereas we influence each other. And that's one of the things I like about the first volume having a legacy in the second volume. There's so many writers in the second volume who were influenced by the first volume and by writers in that. And I'm sure you find that in terms of the sort of publishing that Wasafiri has done over 3 decades or more than that. There is that sort of passing the baton that one gets.
Yeah, no, that's.
How did you feel when you? I mean, I want to turn to hear something about you. I mean, this is a very one-sided conversation. Tell me about, how did you get into Wasafiri? What about Atkal?
Well, actually, I mean, it goes back to, as you know, it goes back to issues around pedagogy and what we read in schools. Right. And actually, in the 80s, Atkal, for those who don't know, was called originally the Association for the Teaching of Caribbean, African, Asian and Associated Literatures, which was a bit of a mouthful. But it was a pressure group and a charity which ran conferences for teachers and librarians and a few academics, but it was mainly targeted at schools. It was mainly targeted at Britain, to try at that point in the 80s and late 70s, actually it was founded in 78, to get people to start reading these books in the classroom, and so that they wouldn't be deprived of all this reading, which is British writing. And when that organization folded, due to the fact that actually at the time there were several sort of then called multicultural inspectors who went around schools, and the whole thing began to take off, I suggested with some colleagues that Wasafiri, we should try and start a literary magazine, continue the forum for debate and extend it into an international dimension. And basically I just carried on doing it, and it's kind of changed and morphed over the years. I mean, I kind of, one of the things you said, one writer represents them all. I mean, that was definitely one of the reasons that I started Wasafiri, and to have these kind of, Wasafiri actually from the Swahili means traveler, and it's a sort of hybrid of safari. The idea was to set up these dialogues, these intersections across writers, to talk to each other across worlds, not just within Britain, but outside the diasporas and so on. And whilst we were fully aware of the plurality of voices, everybody who reviewed us in the press, of course, said that ethnic minority magazine, and I'd keep saying, no, we're not the other story, we're the whole story. But this debate's been going on and on and on and on. And that conference I mentioned at the beginning, which was called Out of the Margins, you wouldn't call it that today, but in a way, that conversation is still happening. And I suppose that past is really, really important, I think, in terms of how people understand what's going on today. I mean, one of the things I was going to move on to is the whole issue of the past and the present a bit more. And I think, James Baldwin once said, history is not the story of the past, but the present. And then I think you put it in your introduction to Daughters of Africa, later generations stand tall because of what has gone before. And I like that, stand tall. The women stand tall because of what has gone before. And Bernardine, in her essay, actually, even though I should say to everybody, when she's talking about unprecedented times, she's actually talking about a kind of digital revolution at the beginning, that the opportunities available to new millennial Black women writers have been fantastic because they've been able to bypass the normal, predominantly white gatekeepers in mainstream publishing houses. But she does say in that also in that essay that we have to remember the stories of the past, those of us that are long-toothed enough to do so. So I wanted to ask you, we've had amazing things happening in the last couple of years. Obviously, Bernardine's win herself, Roger Robinson, Diana Evans, you know, Candice Carty-Williams, all these people. Do you think this is just a wave, or do you think we're going to, you know, are these things going to stick? You know, you've been involved with so many initiatives, Margaret, you know.
Yeah, no, the initiatives are things that seem to keep going and keep coming and repeat themselves. But I think also one has to remember that although it seems as if that there are more writers now, there are writers who've been overlooked. And in fact, there are so many publishing landmarks that one has to also acknowledge. I mean, if you think that the first African American to publish a collection of poetry was Phyllis Wheatley, and that was published in London in 1773. So it's well worth remembering that those are the sorts of people who are the foremothers, the forerunners, and although I'm always touted as the whatever it is, the first Black woman publisher and the youngest whatever. Well, one has to remember that, well, you know, it's embarrassing. It is embarrassing because when you're doing it, you don't think, oh gosh, I'm the first, whatever it is. No. But John La Rose with New Beacon Books was the first dedicated Black publisher in Britain in 1966. I started publishing in 1967. Then there was Jessica Huntley, who was another Black woman publisher in 1969. So there were these other landmarks in publishing, and something again that we both know well from back in the 80s, 90s was the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books, the Black Book Fair. And that was extraordinarily important in terms of bringing together writers, publishers, people who consumed the creative product from all the continents. So you had people in this country, you had people from the Caribbean, people from Africa, people from Europe, and it had a sort of ripple effect. And it wasn't, as you said, there were writers who were not necessarily all from the same demographic, but they were all part of the same movement. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of Scottish writer like James Kelman.
Yeah,
actually was involved with a Black Book Fair in Glasgow. So there are consequences to making the whole literary output richer, and it has you don't know what the consequence is going to be, and they maybe the writers being published now are being published because they were influenced by things they don't necessarily know, but go back to those early writers and publishers. I'm thinking of people like Clinton Kwesi Johnson, who was publishing then, or those other earlier writers like Jean Binta Breeze. And there are a lot of writers who may not be as well known now, although some of them, like Clinton, obviously are, but who have paved the way for the current generation. And as you say, the digital age makes it easier for people in a way to put their own product out there. But the necessity for having those sometimes small, not necessarily with much money, publishers like New Beacon, Bogle Louverture, Hansib Books, Black Ink Collective. There are quite a few who, some of them came and went, some of them are still here, like Hansib, and they've all contributed to what's happening now in a way that we can't necessarily put our finger on, but it is part of an ongoing process. And I hope it's not going to mean that whatever's happening now, which, as we know, is probably very driven by the events of last year, such as the George Floyd murder, and everybody coming together to pay more attention to the Black Lives Matter movement. I hope that's not something that's just going to kind of be a phase and people will go back to the way they always were. And one of the upsets I always had was when I was doing a tour for a promotional event for New Daughters of Africa in 2019, talking to somebody in the audience who said a mainstream publisher had spoken to them about normal books and diverse books. So that, you know, the normality was the books that didn't necessarily feature or pay much attention to the diversity of the literary world. So I hope that we're now into some sort of new normal with all the writers you've mentioned being published, and I hope more will continue.
Mm. I mean, it's interesting what you were saying about the, you know, the book fair, because I used to go to it, of course, with Wasafiri, and it was a complete mishmash of publishers. I mean, there were lots and lots of Black publishers. There were lots of publishers like the Women's Press and Virago. There was Dangaroo Press from Denmark. And there was a kind of very broadly constituted collectivity politically of people who all had the same aim in terms of changing the face of publishing and opening up what was the so-called canon of literature. And the other thing I think that's really interesting that I'd like to pick up is the, you know, in terms of figures like Phyllis Wheatley, and actually the way your two anthologies are structured in a sense, particularly, you know, in terms of dates really, rather than regions, or is this idea of a kind of continuum that speaks across different periods to each other. So, you know, and it's something that, and I've had to engage with this, and it's interesting that you've done a similar thing with a Cambridge history that I've just published with Mark Stein, which is supposedly the first, but it isn't quite the first, Cambridge history of Black and Asian British writing, and it stands, you know, on the work of Lynn Innes, for example, very much so. But basically there too, we were trying to establish, it's a history, we had to put in periods, but we tried to establish a continuum of voices so that it was intersectional, that was speaking kind of both horizontally and vertically in terms of how those dialogues work. So you started, even though the archives are very uneven, to get some kind of history of all these different voices stretching across periods. So I wondered, I suppose from that I'm going to say is, do you see doing an anthology like that, and yours stretches across genre as well in a very interesting way, across autobiography and diaries and letters and novels, and ours also is called writing rather than literature. It also stretches across genre, not as much as yours, because yours is much more creative. But do you see anthologizing as a kind of activism in itself?
I suppose it is, and it's also publishing in another guise. But the thing that I like most about New Daughters of Africa is that it has a legacy, because out of it, I mean, all the contributors waived fees so that we could have some sort of charitable outcome. And there is now an award called the Margaret Busby New Daughters of Africa Award, which is based at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, which means that an African student from Africa going to SOAS to do a specific course will get a free course of study and free accommodation to International Student House. And that is a direct consequence of the generosity of the contributors to New Daughters of Africa. So that's something that really is very heartwarming. And the other thing that I find fascinating is that within New Daughters of Africa, there are these connections. There are connections with the first volume, people who are influenced, like Audrey Lorde, who was in the first volume, people in the second volume who are influenced. There are mother and daughter acts like Alice Walker in the first volume, Rebecca Walker in the second one, but also within New Daughters of Africa, there's a mother and daughter act, because there's Zadie Smith and there's Zadie's mother, Yvonne Bailey Smith, who's now about to be revealed as a novelist in her own right, courtesy of Myriad Editions, actually. So it's interesting to see that there is an ongoing interconnection between the writers in both volumes, and in a way that it is an unprecedented era, because there are things happening in Britain which are different and will never be the same. And just as, I mean, we're now a year from when Andrea Levy died, and that is a sad thing to remember, but she had such an influence on Black writers, Black women writers, all writers in this country, but particularly that Black British voice, because it had, before then, as I said, there'd been attention focused on African American women. There'd been attention focused a lot on African writers, whether we're talking about Buchi Macheta or Flora Nwapa or Edward Sutherland, who were published in the Heinemann African Writers series. But Andrea had a voice that came out of her experience of being totally rooted in Britain, although very connected with her history in the Caribbean. I don't know whether there's time to read something.
No, that would be great.
I mean, I told her about doing the new volume, and of course, she desperately wanted to be in it. So she chose something that she wanted to be included in New Daughters of Africa, which is an extract from her novel Small Island. So I'm going to read you an abridged version of what she has in New Daughters of Africa, which is from Small Island. Let me ask you to imagine this. Living far from you as a beloved relation whom you've never met. Yet this relation is so dear a kin, she is known as mother. Your own mummy talks of mother all the time. Oh, mother's a beautiful woman, refined, mannerly, and cultured. Your daddy tells you, mother thinks of you as her children. Like the Lord above, she takes care of you from afar. Her photographs are cherished, pinned in your own family album to be admired over and over. Your finest, your best, everything you have that is worthy is sent to mother as gifts. And on her birthday, you sing song and party. Then one day you hear mother calling. She is troubled. She needs your help. Leave home, leave familiar, leave love. Travel seized with waves that swell about you as substantial as concrete buildings. Shiver, tire, hunger. For no sacrifice is too much to see you at mother's needy side. This surely is adventure. After all you've heard, can you imagine, can you believe, soon you will meet mother? The filthy tramp that eventually greets you is she. Can this be that fabled relation you heard so much of? This twisted, crooked, weary woman? This stinking, cantankerous hag? She offers you no comfort after your journey, no smile, no welcome. Yet she looks down at you through lordly eyes and says, who the bloody hell are you? You know I'm talking of England. You know I'm speaking of the mother country. But Britain was at war, you might want to tell me. Of course she will not be at her best. But for me, I had just one question. Let me ask the mother country just this one simple question. How come England did not know me? Now see this, an English soldier, Tommy Atkins, skin as pale as soap, hair slicked with oil and shinier than his boots. See him sitting in a pub, sipping a glass of warming rum and rolling a cigarette from a tin. Ask him, Tommy, now, where's Jamaica? And hear him reply, well, dunno, Africa, innit? And here is Lady Havelock, living in her big house with her ancestors' pictures crowding the walls. Ask her to tell you about the people of Jamaica. Does she see that small boy standing tall in the classroom where sunlight draws lines across the room, speaking of England, of canals, of Parliament and the greatest laws ever passed? Or might she, with some authority, from a book she'd read, tell you of savages, jungles, and swinging from trees? It was inconceivable that we Jamaicans, we West Indians, we members of the British Empire would not fly to the mother country's defense when there was threat. But tell me, if Jamaica was in trouble, is there any major, any general, any sergeant who would have been able to find that dear island? Give me a map. Let me see if Tommy Atkins or Lady Havelock can point to Jamaica. Let us watch them turning the page round, screwing up their eyes to look, turning it over to see if perhaps the region was lost on the back before shrugging defeat. But give me that map. Blindfold me, spin me round 3 times, and I, dizzy and dazed, would still place my finger squarely on the mother country.
Thank you. That's great. I mean, it's a wonderful novel. I'm just trying to remember what year exactly it came out in. I should know it, but it's the 90s, isn't it? 19. I'm sure it's around, yeah, I think it's around 1990 or anyway. I'll check it. But I mean, it's in terms of this whole thing about the continuum, and of course the bonds and the kinship. There's obviously this whole focus around the Windrush, partly around the Windrush generation, which, you know, that story hadn't been told in the same way through an eyes of a woman, you know, talking about waves of literature and waves of publishing. Obviously the focus straight after Windrush was actually on male writers in the main, apart from people like Luna Marson and so on, and Beryl Gilroy, who's more recently begun to be noticed, although she wrote for years and years and years and didn't get noticed. So I think Andrea Levy's, you know, depiction of Windrush is and that generation is really, really important. And even though, as you know, I think Jackie Kay says it's a kind of fiction of a ship, in that it's not really a moment of transition, in that there were always Black and Asian and mixed race people living in Britain. Nevertheless, it was a really significant moment for the British psyche in a way. So we did actually do an issue of Wasafiri in 2018, which focused, I think it was the 70th anniversary. It was just before the Windrush, it was as the Windrush scandal broke, actually, so it was kind of ironic in a way. Yeah. But we were doing a celebration at the British Library around Windrush women, and we published some of Beryl Gilroy's work in praise of love and children, and Jan Scheinborn, as well as had them, and Hannah Lowe did a kind of dialogue with some more recent writers, like Karen McCarthy Wolf, trying to talk about the kind of links between Windrush women, the older generation, and now. So I think, as you say, those kind of continuities are really, really important. I mean, I think we're going to run out of time fairly soon, so I just want to kind of move on briefly to the material practices of publishing, because I know you've been very involved in that as well, as I have. So, you know, there's all these initiatives at the moment, the Penguin, you know, initiatives attempting to publish lots of books by writers of colour. There's a whole move towards reclaiming and refinding books that have disappeared, like Beryl Gilroy's Black Teacher has just been published by Faber. And someone rang me up the other day and said, have you ever heard of it? And I said, yeah, I did. I interviewed her in the 80s, you know. But, you know, that kind of thing is indicative of people not remembering that, you know, there's a kind of history there. Also, I think, you know, Bernardine's done a lot of work with a new Penguin series as well, which is writing Black. So I just wondered if you think the actual culture within publishing and reviewing practices is really changing, because that's so critical to a writer's career. We've published so many women in Wasafiri, and not just the famous ones. We've launched several of them. But actually getting them serious review space by people who actually know what they're talking about, and as you say, aren't just the tokenistic Black critic or whatever writing because they can't find anyone else they think might fit the bill. I just wondered whether you think that kind of culture has changed. I really hope it has, because
I hope it has too. And as you say, publishing is crucial, and all the things that you did through Wasafiri. Again, one has to hope that people remember and continue those. And it's I think what is heartening is to see that there are a lot of writers coming through, but what is disheartening is to see that the industry itself is still not as embracing, if you like, of I hate all these terms like diversity and inclusivity. I think it's just normality, you know, to have everybody represented within the industry. I mean, I was, when you mentioned starting Wasafiri in 1984, I found an article I wrote, well, I found a quote from it, which was think it was published in the New Statesman, it may be something to do with the Black Book Fair, but it says, is it enough to respond to a demand for books reflecting the presence of ethnic minorities while perpetuating the system that does not actively encourage their involvement at all levels? The reality is the appearance and circulation of books supposedly produced with these communities in mind is usually dependent on what the dominant white male community, which controls schools, libraries, bookshops, and publishing houses, will permit. And I think that is the problem. How do we get things reviewed, published? You know, how are we part of the whole industry in a way it's not just somebody doing something for us, but we are part of doing things? That to me is the key. And I just hope that people will find ways for themselves to do it, not just ask you or me what they should do, because you know, we've done it in the ways that we thought were right, but people have to find the ways that actually make sense of what they believe. And if they believe that literature should be richer and include everybody, then they must find a way to make the industry reflect that.
And I think it has to happen really through education at the beginning, you know, with primary, you know, it really has to happen with young children, that people, the mindset changes, that people find different ways of thinking about what is the world they want to read about or live in or believe in.
That reminds me, I haven't mentioned Verna Wilkins, who's another pioneer, and she precisely does that. She thinks one has to start with the children. She started Tamarind Books, which was focused on children's books. And I think that's very true. It's education issue. You have to start so that it's normal when you're a child. So you don't grow up and have to sort of uneducate yourself or relearn things because, you know, you already know how things should be.
I think, I mean, it's certainly one of the things, I mean, outside, obviously, what was going on with ATCAL that motivated me in terms of starting Wasfiri, and I talk about it in Brave New Words, which is really similarly what I read at school. I never got anywhere near the kind of background, which was a mixed race background, that I was actually living through in the 60s. You know, it was the period of Enoch Powell, you know, Martin Luther King got assassinated. I was in my teenage years, but all those political moments began to, you know, have an impact on me, and certainly had an impact on me when I went to Kent, where I actually, for the first time, came across Jean Rhys and Derek Walcott and Kamau Brathwaite and Sam Selvon and so on. And that then became a huge passion, really, to try and make sure that future generations as a teacher weren't deprived of reading these texts. And I think we probably need to move into questions, but I think I'll just read a tiny bit from Bernardine's essay because it's kind of relevant to this. What a time to be a Black British woman writer in Brave New Words. And what she says is, and I'll just pick out some juicy bits. One thing I've learned is that the future won't look after itself. We cannot take any developments for granted and believe that society will ever become more progressively inclusive without our ongoing intervention. If those of us who are considered marginal in some contexts, this includes all women, stop campaigning, we experience social regression. I wonder what will happen if the support systems, networks, and development programs for people of colour cease to exist. The plethora of books currently being published, including poetry and to a lesser extent fiction, is astonishing considering the history of uninterest. But we must be wary because today's boom is not the result of a steady incremental transition from marginalization towards the publication and celebration of books in all genres over many decades. So I think I'll stop there. But I think in a way she says it also, she's talking.
Yeah. And I think Brave New Words has got so many, I mean, that's a wonderful essay and it's got so many other insightful essays in. So I hope that's going to get as much publicity as it should too.
Thank you. Is that
Thank
a good
you,
place
Myriad.
to stop? We can go on. I mean, I've got lots more to say.
Thank you both. Thank you both so much for this wide-ranging discussion. I would absolutely want to open the floor to questions. You can raise your hands using the sort of hand function, or you can pop them in the chat. And we actually already have a question from Juanita Cox. I wonder if I could ask you to ask your question yourself, either through the audio or video function.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I was just fantastic discussion, by the way, really enjoying it. I just wanted to ask about today's report. You will have seen Tony Sewell's report was published today. And one of their claims is that the UK no longer has a system rigged against people from ethnic minorities. I just wanted to get a sense of your initial response to the report and whether you kind of agreed with the general findings.
I'd like to know what you think, Juanita.
Well, my views don't really come into this, but yeah, very surprised by the findings, to be honest. But yeah,
I haven't had a chance to read it, actually, I must say, but from the few headlines I saw on my phone, it sounds slightly disturbing, to put it mildly. Yeah, given what's been going on.
Yeah, I think there needs more time to digest it, because today's not been full of much time for me.
I think the main thrust of it is that actually it's the things that are affecting the Black community are more to do with class than to do with race. So I wondered if you would say that was one of the things that affected the publishing industry. I mean, is it more race rather than class? Or because it sounds a little bit from the discussion you had that it's more to do with kind of race and gender.
I think it's in the publishing industry that there's a way things have always been done.
Yeah.
And it does impact on race, gender, class, all sorts of things. And I think we just have to find new ways of doing things better rather than relying on the way things have always been done.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple of other questions as well in the chat already. One from Fina.
Yes. Hello, Margaret.
Hi.
So I'm a young publishing editorial. I've worked sort of in Penguin as an editorial assistant, and I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts and opinions on the obstacles that were facing Black women within the industry in your day, in terms of career progression, in terms of support within the publishing framework from the editorial side, and whether you feel like we've progressed or whether you feel like things have stayed the same in terms of career advancement and wages and things like that. Just sort of that comparison, whether it's shifted vastly, whether it's sort of stayed the same.
Well, it's in a way, it's hard for me to compare because, as you heard, I started my own company, so I was not within a system. In fact, I did once apply for a job before I could afford to go full time with Margaret Busby, and I got an interview. It was all done by post. I turned up for the interview, and someone just phoned up and said, "There's a Black girl here who says she's got an interview." So we're going back to the 60s now, and I would hope it wouldn't happen now. They might think that, but I think one also had to remember that the editorial department is not the only department in the publishing company.
No.
So that's always a department everybody wants to get into. I like books, I must be in the editorial department, but there are other departments. I don't know that there are any greater challenges in that department. But I think in a way that is a department that can benefit most from having a range of different sorts of people working as editors, because you have different perspectives depending on who you are, where you're from, what you know, what you've learned. And I don't know there's any quick answer to your question, and I hope you're not going to find any major obstacles, but good on you being there and just keep going.
Thank you. I guess it's sort of difficult because, as you said, there's so many moving parts. You've got sales, you've got marketing, and it's really difficult in editorial when you're trying to explain the heart of a book with cultural specificity. and you have to almost sell it. And because that experience isn't in majority, sometimes you find yourself having to push harder. And I just wanted to know if maybe that was a reason why you found so much autonomy and independence in starting your own company. You sort of had this, you had more kind of control, maybe editorial control, and you didn't have to convince. There was no sort of infrastructure that limited you. You had to persuade in order to publish what you believed in. Yeah, I don't think there was a question in there.
I think, well, for me anyway, it was definitely that. I felt what I wanted to see happening in publishing wasn't happening, and I didn't see the writers that I wanted to see. Although there were, you know, a few books, but they were largely, in terms of women, Black women's publishing, and obviously Black was differently defined in the 80s. It was kind of political Blackness, but there was just, it was just African American, you know, mainly, until I got asked by Ros de Lanrol to do a book called Motherlands in the 90s. It was really African American writers primarily. And with Wasafiri, I really wanted to do it, and I had absolutely no idea how to run a magazine. I'd never been an editor before. I just believed in it. And I think actually that faith takes you a very long way, unfortunately. And but nowadays it's much harder to do that. You know, you can't just suddenly say, oh, I think I'll start a magazine and I'll get the funding and I'll do this, that, and the other. It was very much a community of people who were really supportive at the time, actually, that enabled me personally to steer my path, and carried on doing so, actually, through the 3.5 decades I did it.
Please don't give up, though.
Thank you. I've actually founded my own magazine in 2018 for Black writers. So I really relate to what you're saying, and it's actually inspired me. But I won't take up much space on it. I've got my eye on the time and the 7 minutes, so I'll let someone else go. But thanks.
Send us information about your magazine.
I will. I'll put it in the chat. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Taiba.
Hi, I was just wondering, I wanted to ask, what are your views on the education system, and what do you think can be done to bring in more diversity to our education system?
I think, well, I'm just at the moment, as it happens, consulting on something called the OCR exam board, who are trying to change their GCSE and A-level syllabus. But you know, it's quite a complicated process. I think the thing to do is to actually change the text so people read different things when they're studying. That makes a huge difference, and it makes a huge difference at university, and I think I've already indicated at primary school level as well. But the structures of education have to also be changed. Like, you know, the exam boards need to put forward text that they see as being canonical, if you like, although, you know, I don't necessarily agree in terms of canons, but that's how they're perceived, that they have to be perceived as being worthy enough as literature to be read. And if they're put on the syllabus by mainstream exam boards, then they will be seen as worthy to be read. But even whilst we're doing this now, there's a kickback from teachers, because unlike, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of it. I'm just trying to think of something like The Crucible, say, unlike one of those sort of Arthur Miller's The Crucible, where there's reams and reams of critical material for teachers to read. With some of the texts we want to put on, which are new, or there's not so much written about them, or there's not so much resource, then the teachers say, oh, we don't want to teach that because we don't know what to do with it. And because they themselves haven't been to universities where they've been taught these texts, they don't know how to approach them. So you get into a kind of cycle. So I think the way to do it is you have to change the structures of the education system at a very fundamental level, is my view. But you can only do it piece by piece.
Thank you very much.
So we have a few questions left, but we don't have that much time left. So I'm going to summarize a couple and then jump to Neha for the final question, and then you can answer all of them or bits and pieces of one. So we have one from Nawal, who's looking for books written by Black women about their experiences as the Windrush generation, particularly Black women in interracial relationships, ideally written in the 50s and 70s. So Noelle is looking for some tips. Mariam's asking, could you talk about the opportunities you see in the future for independent publishing in light of the large publishers merging into so few large multinational companies? And Neha, can I ask you to quickly come in with your question, and then we'll get your final thoughts.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I'll try to ask this quite quickly. I'd actually just wanted to get your thoughts on the role of the Black British translator as a creative role in itself, especially when talking about Black voices. And I've been thinking through this when translation really comes into the question when thinking about translating Anglophone work into regional languages. But I was just thinking about the authorial agency and input that goes into translating languages based on oral linguistic systems into European languages. There's a lot of authorial agency and input that comes in there, and I just wanted to ask what your thoughts were on that role and where it sits in the pantheon of Black British writing. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry I have a stutter.
Thank you. Over to you, Susheila.
I don't know that much about it. For example, I was just thinking about Linton's work, actually. I think some of that's been translated into Italian. And I was just trying to think as you were speaking and asking that question, how you would translate some of his poems into an Italian voice. And I think that would apply to writers like Jean Winter-Breeze and a lot of the kind of dub poets and oral poets, even Grace Nichols. I think I know quite a few texts in my work as executive of Sam Selvon's estate. Quite a lot of his novels have been translated so The Lonely Londoners has been translated into German, for example, and into Spanish. I don't read German, so I can't really tell you what that voice would be, but I think the point you're making is a really interesting one, because actually, paradoxically, until recently, there's been more scholarship and academic work going on outside Britain in terms of Black British writing than there has been within Britain, which is actually an interesting point in itself. And so therefore, a lot of universities in Europe and a lot of universities in the States and in other parts of the world want to teach these texts and of course want them translated. So I think the point you're making is a really important one, and it actually is something we should be thinking about in terms of how to enact that. I think one's often thinking of translation the other way around, as you say, but it would be interesting to see how these Black British texts could be translated.
I think we probably need a whole session on that.
Yeah, no, it's a completely different, it's a really interesting question.
It's important.
Any thoughts on the reading suggestions for Noelle or Mariam's question about the sort of the kind of opportunities for independent publishing with the kind of large multinational companies on the rise?
I can't off the top of my head think of a Windrush. I could if I looked it up in 2 minutes, but at the moment I can't think of one. But I think there are some in that Windrush issue of What's a Theory.
Yeah.
But I can't just remember the names off the top of my head. But Margaret, maybe you should do the publishing. I'll have a quick think.
I can't remember what the question is now.
The future of independent publishing, I guess, really.
Well, I think independent publishers are crucial. I think in a way it's worrying as you see the conglomerates getting bigger and bigger, and you still have wonderful imprints and people within the companies, but I think there's something about the passion that small independents like Myriad Editions, who published both New Daughters of Africa and Brave New Words, that they bring to every book that they do. It's not even a question of front list and back list, or this is our lead title for the season or whatever, because every title that an independent does is promoted, is published with the same vigor, passion, and enthusiasm. I think that is the benefit. You don't have to go through some sort of hierarchical system to get permission from an overlord to do something once you've taken a book on. So I think that's why we have to hope that independents and small publishers continue and are able to keep producing wonderful books like New Daughters of Africa and Brave New Words.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, Margaret and Susheila. It's been so amazing listening to you talking about everything to do with publishing, pedagogy, questions around diversity, or really normality, as you say, and its representation in literature. I can't possibly summarize all the wonderful kind of nuggets of ideas and food for thought you've given us today. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your experiences with us, and Susheila for talking so expertly on your own life and career in Wasafiri, which sets up our students very well for the session we'll be doing next week. But thank you all for coming as well. And I'm gonna end there because we've taken up enough of your time, Margaret and Susheila.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you.
Thanks,
so much.
Susheila. Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thanks.